it's closely related to the Gender Gap in Science project that Alice mentioned. That's the link to the website of this project. This is an interdisciplinary and an international project that started in 2017 and is about to finish. It got a grant from the International Science Council, and money is disappearing this year, basically. So this is the website. Many scientific unions take part in this project, and the full title is quite long, so we call it the Gender Gap Project. But the idea was to measure the gender gap across disciplines and think of ways to reduce it if there is any gap. So it had 3 tasks. One was a global survey. The global survey was open last year. Then a study of patterns of publication, analyzing databases, and the elaboration of a database of lists with a list of good practices and initiatives that are taken in different places across the world. And so there were coordination groups that were in charge of these tasks. And it has a very active Twitter account, I think. So Alba, if you can connect it to our Twitter. And there were 3 regional workshops that were organized at the beginning of the project. And one was in Asia, another one was in Latin America, in Colombia, and another one in South Africa. And many of the people that are here today went to the Latin American regional workshop. And the 3 tasks I mentioned were related to some activities that some of the scientific unions had done before. The study of publication patterns had been done by some mathematicians, analyzing databases of mathematical publications. The good practices is something that most of the scientific unions do. And the global survey was related to one that we had done within physics in 2009-2010 that was carried out by the Statistical Research Center of the American Institute of Physics. And so when we thought of having a global survey in this project, we also asked the Statistical Research Center of the AIP to take care of it. And this, the AIP organized the questionnaire, but we gave input in the regional workshops. We analyzed the questions and suggested changes, inclusions, etc. And the AIP hosted the survey and is hosting the data. So these are a few things about the survey. It was open last year. It collected about 34,000 responses from many countries. The data is accessible if you present a proposal. Maybe Laura is going to explain how you could do that if you're willing to analyze some of the data. And then the analysis of publication patterns was performed only on 3 databases that were sort of open to the people who did the analysis. One is ZBMath, which is a very comprehensive database of mathematical journals. The archive, that is the open place for preprints in mostly physics and mathematics. And ADAS, which is astronomy, astrophysics, but it's also a lot of physics there. It's based on the NASA database. And we are finalizing the report of the project, and so all the analysis will be posted on the website of the project, and you will be able to go and look at plots about this publication pattern analysis. And also the database is being finalized, and all the entries have been categorized in terms of 7 dimensions, not 8. But the problem with the database is that it's mostly in English, so many of the initiatives of our countries are not included there. So we should try to replicate this in our region with our language. And so the report is under elaboration. We are going to have a closing activity at the other ICTP, the one in Trieste, the original one. And we are going to have a hackathon on Thursday to enter Wikipedia profiles of women scientists of all disciplines. So if you have suggestions of women that we could make profiles of, you can send them to me by email. And as I told you, the final report will be available at the webpage of the project. When we had the Latin American regional workshop, we said we want to know what happens with the global survey. Let's do another workshop 2 years from now. And this is this workshop, basically. And it was not the only spin-off that I would say grew out of that workshop. We also have a Facebook group to exchange information. We also have a website that I maintain, so I don't know, I updated it for this meeting, but then there are periods during which I do nothing, basically. But anyway, this is the website of the Gender Gap in Science. I like that I've seen pictures of South Central and Central America and Mexico, let's say, that were upside down, but I never seen it lying like this. So I liked it because it's some sort of transversality. So I think of this as transversal Latin America, this idea. You have lists of good practices in the region there. The Facebook group I told you, which is linked to the one we created here. And then we wrote a book that we edited with Lilia. We are going to talk about the book later, tomorrow. The book has contributions from the people who attended the workshop in Bogota, telling about initiatives in Latin America to try to reduce the gender gap. And it was published by the Mexican Physical Society and with funds from the Gender Gap Project. This is the cover of the book. We are the editors. And so in this workshop, we are going to have a talk by Laura, who is going to speak next. She's from the AIP Statistical Research Center, is that? Okay. And she's going to talk about the results of the global survey, what we obtained for Latin America. Then I will talk a little bit about the good practice list. There are going to be various talks by participants of the Bogota workshop and also by other participants. We will present the book and many other things, and we want to keep on discussing what to do to make our region more gender equitable and more diverse in positions of decision and in the scientific community. So these are some pictures, and welcome to the workshop. And so now I leave the floor to Laura, who is going to talk about the global survey.
Okay. Can folks hear me okay? Sounds like it works.
I think
I did plug it in.
Oh,
Maybe? Nope, no signal.
They were.
Oh.
You have to.
He just told me to plug it in.
Oh, that's what he said.
But I'm doing it.
There.
Oh no.
Let's see. I don't know how this works.
We did test this and it worked when we tested it.
But then he changed so I can use my computer. So we don't know how to get that source. Do you need to touch this?
No.
Okay. So maybe you can reboot your computer.
So I'll just start talking a little bit and then we'll jump into the slides once they get up. Slovenia did a wonderful job of introducing the project, so I actually had a little bit of that written out that we're going to be able to skip over, which is really nice. The main part of what I'm going to talk about today is the breakdown of the numbers that we did based on Latin America. So for us, for the project itself, we have these different regions that were identified. So today I'll be presenting the data on South America and also Central and the Caribbean. So a lot of those numbers are pulled together. There's also, as folks here know, there's a lot of differences that exist within those regions. So I will pull apart some of the key findings from South America and from the Caribbean and Central America so that we can see some of the cultural differences that exist in those different areas.
I would reboot the computer.
Well. I can try to plug mine in, but I don't know. I'll just talk a little bit. So I guess one thing to note, the way that the survey was designed, Slovenia talked about it a little bit, but what we really focused on was understanding childhood, so the early years of what's happening with scientists. We wanted to look at early adulthood. So what's your high school experience? When did you choose to be in your field? When did you choose to be a scientist? And then we had a lot of questions about university. So we looked at undergraduate, master's degree, and your PhD at all different levels, and then career. And career is really a big piece of this. This is where we really want to explore and understand a lot of the differences for what's happening in gender. All of the analysis that you're going to see today is broken down by women and men. For this survey, we didn't have any additional gender categories that folks could choose, which is something that was a decision that was made at a higher level. So the analysis today is really just looking at the differences between women and men. So I want to put that out there, and we understand there's limitations of that, and that's only a subsect of the population and only a part of the population that we even identified. Sure.
Let's try. ¿Tiene HDMI or no?
I don't think so.
Okay, so let's go with this. Do you have VGA?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Maybe? No, now we just turned it off altogether.
Oh, there it is.
All right, perfect.
Okay. Let's see. You can put it on top. Yeah. Okay.
Got a lot of slides here. Yes. Okay. Okay, so we're going to jump right into the data with this. So here, this is the overview. So before we break down and start to look at Latin America, I just wanted you to understand the larger survey and the larger population that we're working with. So as Savina said, there was over 32,000 responses as of December. The survey technically is still open, and some of those responses will be, those will be included in some of the final analysis, but there's very few people still participating because it's not being advertised. Yeah, very few people knew. No. Yeah, that was just yeah. So something that's pretty remarkable is that the survey, we did get a 50-50 response from men and women that participated in the survey. So we know that that's not representative of the population. It's not representative of the population of people in science. So women are actually overrepresented in this breakdown in the data that we have. The data itself is not representational, right? So the way that we did it was a snowball methodology. And what that means is, Silvina talked about all these great meetings that we had. All of the folks from those meetings sent the survey out to everyone that they know in science. We sent it out to some big lists. So there's some physical unions who sent it out to all of their members. We got it out to as many people as we possibly could. But it's not a sample that we can say is statistically significant for us to draw. It's not representative. Does that make sense for folks? It's an important thing to understand because it limits the type of analysis that we can do. So really all the data is saying is that of the people who answered our survey, this is what's going on. We can't say that, based on this figure, we can't say that 50% of all scientists are women, right? That's something that's not accurate. But we can say of the women who answered this survey, this is what's going on with them. This is what their experiences and realities are. All right, again, this is kind of the larger picture. So of all the respondents, these are the disciplines that we were looking at. So folks were able to identify their primary field of study, and they had other times if their field of study changed throughout the survey, they could say that. But this is just to give you an idea. So the majority, or not the majority, but the largest number of respondents we had were from physics. It's a very active community. A lot of that is because we had done surveys out to the physics community before. And then it was followed by mathematicians, computer science, and then you can see kind of the numbers going down from there. Are there folks in this room that are part of one of the disciplines that's below the top 3? Yeah, so I think we've got some biologists who are in the room, a couple of folks that are in those areas. Again, all of the data that I'm reporting today is going to be statistically significant. So we had numbers that were big enough that I can show them to you today. There are times when the numbers were too small, and then I can't show you that data. So that's something to keep in mind. If there's a reason that something's excluded, it's probably because the numbers, once we broke them down, got too small. Here's a map overall, so you can see where the numbers were collected. So we were able to collect from 159 unique countries, which was exciting for us. You can look at what the distribution is. You can see Brazil did a great job of getting the survey out. And so that darker color is where there's a higher concentration, and then it kind of goes down from there. So in future surveys and future work, when we do this, we really need to work on, a lot of the continent of Africa is missing representation. So we can see, as much as we can try to elevate those voices from what we have, there's a lot of voices that we're not even getting to that are in region. So, and you can see some of that in Central and South America as well, in some areas that are excluded because we just don't have enough people who are responding. Of the overall respondents, the vast majority of folks did have their university degrees, and then it kind of goes down, but we had almost 17,000 of the individuals had their PhDs, so that's an overall view of what the whole population looks at. Now we're going to do what's a little bit more fun, and we're going to dig into Latin America and show you some of the numbers you're probably more interested in. So again, like I said, in order to look at Latin America, this includes results from South America, the Caribbean, and Central America. All right, so we're going to look at a few of these same graphs so you can see how the distribution is different for these regions, right? So here, this is the breakdown just of how many respondents we're looking at. So we had just over 4,000 individuals who responded to the survey from those regions. You can see here it's about 53% women and 47% men. So there's still, it's not something that's statistically different for that representation, but it's a little bit different than the overall population. These are the primary fields that we saw in Latin America. So there was a lot of people who chose others, so they fell outside of our main category. The second largest group was physics, so that reflects what we saw in the larger population. And then we see mathematics, bio, and you can kind of read down. So one of the things that changes is computer science. So in the larger population, computer science had more representation than we see in Latin America. This is just a breakdown so that you can see what's actually happening with gender in each of these areas. So of the respondents, you can look at the different main disciplines that we were interested in, and you can see what percent are women and what percent are men. So here, the bottom half of the column, the orange is the women and the top is the men. So you can see, the history and philosophy of science, which is the only non-STEM field that we have. There's a large number of women that are there. Biology, as we talked about a little bit before, that's where you see higher representation of women. The lowest representation that we got here is for math and for physics. Again, these are of the respondents. And then this is just a breakdown so you can see the degrees, the university degree, the master's, And the doctoral follows a very similar trend to what we saw in the overall population. Okay, so now we're going to start to get into some of the questions that were asked and what the results of those questions are. So a lot of these graphs have a lot going on, so we can work through them together. If there's questions that you have, feel free to throw up your hand and ask them while we're talking. But here, we asked people how they would rate their overall experience in their doctoral degree. This isn't something that's important to understand the gender differences, because we try to understand why people stay in their doctoral programs and why they leave them. And part of that is their experience within those programs. So here you can see the green, the dark green and the light green is kind of on the positive end, and then the reds are the negative. The real difference and the important difference that we see is the relationship with the advisor or supervisor. So you can see that women have a statistically more negative relationship with their advisor. Oh, I can point.
Yeah, it has a pointer and also to...
Perfect.
To change the slides.
Yes. All right. So up here, this is the part that we're really interested in this difference between men and women with their relationship with their advisor. And part of the reason is because the literature shows if you have a negative relationship with your advisor, you're less likely to complete your degree. And this is an area that we could act, right? This is something that we could do. We could work with advisors so that they understand how to be better advisors to women. We can also be working on having more women who are in the roles of being advisors so that they can advise women. And that's one way that we can have solutions to some of the gender gaps. So those are the types of questions that we're most interested in exploring. Yeah.
You can change with that.
Fancy. Okay. So here's another one. Again, there's a lot going on in this slide, but this is asking you who most encouraged you in your studies. So we do see some pretty significant gender differences between encouragement. So this is saying who said that you can be a scientist, who said that, you know, when your class got hard that you should keep trying. And this graph, just so you know, the way that it's organized is you have just from highest to lowest. So you're going to see differences in the orders on these columns. So for the female responses, their biggest supporter were their parents. For males, they said that their biggest supporter was themselves, that they do it all on their own, right? So this is something that we really have to ask a little bit about analysis, right? Do men understand who's supporting them? Do they even see what's happening, what those cultural differences are? So something that's interesting there. Women also say, you know, that they are often their biggest supporter, but, you know, there's a clear difference there. So the survey collected a lot of quantitative data. It also collected qualitative data. And it's really important that we don't just look at the numbers, you know, as folks have said already today, but that we're hearing the voices and hearing the stories. So I do have some collections of the qualitative data of different responses to the survey and some different trends that were pulled out of it. So when you look at qualitative, you normally group ideas and trends together. And this is the very beginning of that analysis because, again, we have tens of thousands of responses of what people are saying. So we asked people about their university experience, and we gave them a chance to talk further about it, right? So not just looking at the numbers, but what are their experiences? There was a lot of positive experience. So people said that it was significant, that it was a decisive period in their life, that it changed their life, that their studies were interesting, that they built new knowledge. The women were still talking about how wonderful it was and how much they grew during their university experience.
Is it women? So those two responses?
These are all women.
Oh, these are
Yeah, all these responses are from women. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of women who talk about discouragement and isolation. So here you can see, which is, again, an idea we've talked about today, but some of the lecturers actually discouraged me to continue my studies in front of a class of 60 students with 3 women. I realized that there was no point in attending his lectures and studied on my own, with results beyond 90 for this particular course. So this was somebody who was studying physics in Brazil, who is paying for an education and is not getting that education because their professor is saying that it's not worth it, so they do it on their own. So this is an important example of how women are coping and what they're doing to survive and continue in education, but it's something that is certainly not equitable. So it's important to kind of understand those pieces. We had a lot of people talk about the isolation. This is somebody from biology in Mexico who says that they were the only female in their class. Again, this is important because people talk about biology, that there's so many women, but you don't always have that. You're still often isolated in those fields. So.
Do you know what kind of age these people are?
I don't have it on here. We do in the database. So, and if there's people who want to do research on the qualitative, looking at some individuals, you can request this data and then you can get the different variables for it. Here is another, just an example of discouragement and isolation. So when I started the program in physics, I was the only woman, and now at my work as a research teacher, I'm also the only woman. There are a lot of situations in which I'm subjected to contempt and discrimination because of my gender. So this is somebody who is in physics in Bolivia, but it's just important to understand it's not just in the classroom. These things are continuing throughout their experience.
Something I forgot to tell. The survey was in different languages, and Spanish was one of them.
Yes.
Not Portuguese. I
Correct.
received complaints by people from Brazil. But so you translated the responses?
Yes. Yeah. So all of the responses were translated. Yeah. Which is a good point. So it wasn't just if you could write in English that you could give a response. You could give a response in, I think we had 7 or 8 different languages. So another important theme that came up around their university experience was whether or not individuals had career guidance. So this was something that we see very different between men and women. A lot of men talk very positively about career guidance. So they know what their jobs are, they know what the market is, they know what they have to do to get there. We don't always see that same dynamic for women, even though they're in the same field. People aren't talking about it, about how you can be a scientist in a lab someday. You know, they're telling men that, but they're not telling women that. So that was something that we saw a lot of. Here it's just highlighted, I guess, a little bit, and I never had professional guidance. So those are the types of quotes that we heard over and over again. So now jumping back to some of the quantitative data, so something else that we asked students was we asked all the participants, was during their doctoral studies, did you have enough of the following to conduct your research? So one of the things that's really important, as most people in this room know, in order to do your research, you need to have resources, you need to have opportunities. And something that we see is that there's gender differences that exist between different opportunities. So in this set, except for equipment, which is kind of strange, equipment shows up really high for women here. 75% of women say they have enough equipment and only 20% of men. But aside from that, every single category, women say that they have less access to that resource than men do for Latin America. And this equipment thing is something that's unique to Latin America. So that's something for us to dig into a little bit more and understand what's happening there. But, you know, these are really big ideas, you know, so if you don't have what you need as a working parent, if you don't have the funding, if you don't have the office space, you can't get the work done. Here's another one. So something that we look at a lot is interruptions, both interruptions during your studies and interruptions during your career, and what impacts that has. So here we just ask the basic question, have there been any significant interruptions in your doctoral studies? As you can see, women are much more likely to report that they have had interruptions compared to men. And then we can dig in a little bit more to understand what these interruptions are. So the vast majority of interruptions for women is childbirth or raising children. It's generally around that. There's actually less around care of family now, so that's something that we're starting to see change. It used to be that women primarily had interruptions because they were caring for older family members, and we're actually seeing those numbers decline, which we'll have to explore a little bit more about what's happening. But so that's one of the things. All right, so something else that we asked about, so again, going back to the qualitative, we talked to everybody about their doctoral experiences, and we just asked, you know, what happened, what was your experiences, and we had a lot of different types of responses. So a lot of women talked about support, and especially if you had a positive experience, you generally talked about the support that existed around you. So here is someone from Brazil, and they said, my doctoral experience was excellent. I had full professional and familial support. I completed it in 3 years, when the norm here in Brazil is 4, with a lot of success. The institute I attended gives full support to the students, and I never heard about any prejudice of any kind. This is a very unique experience that I don't think is replicated often, but I showed it just to highlight the fact that it really is about having the resources and the support around you in order to have a positive experience. Again, the idea or the notion of advisors comes up, both positively and negative. Here, my supervisor had a strong preference for 2 doctoral students, both of them men. He asked me to leave the doctoral program on more than one occasion. So something that we see, if you do not have a positive experience with your advisor, it's very hard for you to complete your degree. Women are less likely to have positive experiences with their advisor. It happens for a variety of reasons. This next one highlights a little bit of that. So harassment by my advisor was one of the problems that really impacted this woman. She had to ask for a change of her director, the thesis director, and it was granted, but because of the change, she had to change her thesis, she had to change the topic she was working on, and it slowed down her career and her progression. So again, these are the types of things that folks are kind of dealing with at different levels in their programs. Another thing that comes up a lot, and people talk about in a lot of different ways, and we'll have some numbers to back up some of these different stories, but folks talk a lot about harassment. So here's another one. I started my doctorate with another supervisor, a man, but he was my bachelor's degree and master's degree supervisor, but he was sexually harassing me. He died during the first semester, and so I felt free, and I was able to change my supervisor. I had a female supervisor and a person of excellent human qualities. If I hadn't been like that, I don't know if I could have finished my doctorate degree. So this is somebody from math in Mexico, and the notion that we have to wait for advisors to die before we can have real opportunities in the classroom is not much of a solution, right? That's not the solutions that we're looking for today, but it's something that's a reality for a lot of people. And I know that it sounds funny, but a lot of the times we sit back and we talk about, this department is terrible, but it's really just this one old white dude, and he's going to die off eventually, and then it'll be okay. And unfortunately, that's also not really the case, right? There's these systemic problems that we have to address that are preventing opportunities for a lot of women and people of color. But this was one example of it truly happening, where sometimes it's the best way for them to leave. All right. Here's another example of people talking about resources. So this relates back to some of the graphs from before. So the quote is, at the university where I am, there are many scholarship holders, and we have no office and no desk of our own. There is a lack of equipment, but we go to other universities or work groups to help that. The lab is small, and we have to take turns to work, so it often results in delays. So this is somebody in chemistry in Argentina. When you don't have access to resources, you can't do your research, and you can't do it in an effective way. And again, women are shown to have less access to resources than men in most of the fields that we're looking at. This is just one example of how it actually plays out for them. If you're trying to do your experiment and you have to wait 3 weeks until you can get any lab space, then it's going to slow down your career progress. Here's just some other examples of people kind of having to wait and figure out and losing time because they don't have the support that they need, either through equipment or through their supervisors, through the money that they need resources to in order to continue their degrees. Another thing that people talked a lot about was doubt. So these are just some pretty basic comments that we saw a lot. We saw a lot of variations of this. So people often said that they were insecure about what they were doing. They said it was stressful, that they felt alone, and then you also had some folks who just said, I'd rather not remember it. Doctoral experiences shouldn't be this overarching negative experience in the way that we're seeing from a lot of the comments from this. There's a big gender gap. There's a gender difference in how people perceive these experiences and how people are experiencing their doctoral programs. One of the things that's important, and a lot of literature shows, it doesn't come from this study, but women are much more likely to feel insecure, to feel that their grades aren't high enough, even though men are often actually receiving lower grades. So there was a study that was done where women, if they get a B- or lower, they're likely to drop out of STEM programs. Men are often fail at least one class and will still remain in. So the perception of failure is really different, and you see women beating themselves up a lot about it, and we're losing people because of that. And unfortunately, that's something we hear over and over again about women saying they're not good enough, even though the quantitative evidence does not show that. All right, so now back into some of these big gnarly graphs. So here we're looking at the main reasons for interruptions. So sorry, this probably should have gone up before those ones. The main reasons for interruptions, as I said before, are very different between men and women. Please note again that the answers are not consistent across the gender breakdowns. So most women are reporting that they were interrupted because of pregnancy or child rearing, where men are reporting their main interruption as financial constraints. This is something that falls around a lot of typical gender stereotypes a lot, that men are supposed to be the breadwinners, so if they have financial problems, they have to leave, they don't have the external support, and women, have to raise the children, and they have to take time to do that. We asked if these breakdowns these slowdowns, impacted their career and how it impacts different people's careers. So there's a lot going on in this graph as well, but we can see the differences in the impacts of the careers. So here, 68% of men said that it impacted their professional reputation, of women, versus only 54%. Let me just look at the numbers, sorry. All right, let's look at the numbers here together. So did the breakdown slow down your career? Not at all here, which is one of the things that we can look at. So men, the top one, said that if they had a slowdown, it did not affect their personal career, 46%, versus women, only 34% said that it did not impact their career. Women were also more likely to say that the slowdowns impacted the work that they do. So a lot of times after women would come back from their break or interruption, they were put on more secretarial work, desk jobs, and they were kind of taken out of the scientific realm. It changed the work that they were doing. This is something that's a little bit different than trends that we see globally. It's something that's more unique to Latin America in the differences being this high, so it's something that's important to explore for this region.
Which one is more different? You said the second one? The one
Yeah, both of them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here's another question where we asked if there was difficulty finding positions or professional opportunities. So this can be at any stage of their career, but most folks are talking about right after they're leaving education. And you can see that for men, 11% said that it was significantly difficult compared to 15% of women. And then kind of how that piles up. For some difficulty, we have 44% of women reporting that they had some difficulty finding jobs compared to 39% of men. I know those numbers don't look that big, but with the population size for this question, it's something that is statistically significant. So there is a statistical difference for these two groups here. All right, so now something else that gets talked about a lot is publication. And they talk about whether or not it's that women just aren't publishing or they don't have time because they have work-life balance, or, and if that's what we have to address in order to get more women to publish. So something that we asked about was, during the last 5 years, how many articles have you submitted? So it's not how many were accepted, but it's how many you submitted to top-ranked journals in your field. Over here, you have male responses, and you can see that this first number, to understand, this is 0. So women are more likely to say that they've never submitted any articles to top-ranked journals. When we look at overall journal submissions, we don't see that same difference, but once you go to top-ranked journals, you see that women are less likely to be submitting. So that's something to note. But then once you drop down and you're looking at kind of number of articles 1 through 5, those numbers are actually higher for women than they are for men. So once women feel empowered to start submitting to top-ranked journals, they're actually submitting more articles than a lot of men in their field. So this is something to be looking at and figuring out how do we encourage this group of women to start participating? Another thing that people like to talk a lot about is salary. And it sounds like there might have been some discussions around salary earlier in the meeting, and something that's becoming an important topic around Brazil. This is just broken down for Latin America, as with all these other graphs. And something that's important to understand here is that we ask the respondents kind of relatively how they understand their salary versus their colleagues. So the question is very simple. It says, compared to your colleagues in your workplace with similar qualifications as you, do you think your salary or pay is higher, similar, lower, or I don't know? So men are more likely to say that their pay is higher than their colleagues. Men are more likely to say that it's similar, although these numbers are very similar. Women are more likely to say that their pay is lower. So this is something that we can see the pay gaps. We'll have to look longitudinally with the physics to see if we're starting to see any change in this. But women are still being paid less than men, doing similar work with similar qualifications. Something else that we looked at is women compared to their spouses, or individuals compared to their spouses. So here we asked if you make more than your spouse. For women, only 24% of women said that they make more than their spouse compared to 50% of men. So this is something that's really interesting, especially when we cross it to families where you have women are more likely to say that they also have a PhD spouse in the same field than men are, and they're more likely to be at a similar employment level for the folks who are responding to this as men, yet they're still making less. So that's something we can start to break down and kind of look at what's actually happening. So if you're a professional in a university and your spouse is also in the field, those are the types of numbers that we can start to get out with this data, which is exciting. All right, so here's another one on how did your work or career change because you're a parent. So first we asked people if they are a parent, and if they were, they got a subset of questions that asked specifically about being a parent. So here, again, you can see we've got the female responses that are on the left. So for women, the way that becoming a parent impacted them is that they chose a less demanding or more flexible work schedule. They spent less time at work, and that their career slowed, right? Those are kind of the main categories. For men, they said that their main category is that their work and career did not change significantly. So this is something that's really important to understand. In previous surveys, we've actually found that globally, men are generally rewarded for having children, while women face these kind of repercussions at work. So,
have you seen any differences with other regions?
Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so especially with Europe, there's areas where you have a lot more support for raising families, and we start to see that. Actually, I think the numbers are worse in the US, and whether or not that's perception or reality, but the argument is that there's less family support in the US, so women end up taking on a lot of the role themselves versus in some areas in Latin America where you can have family support to help raise children. But yes, it's not consistent with global numbers. Something that was interesting, so 7% of women became stay-at-home parents versus 4% of men. And that's something that does change regionally as well, and it's something to start to look at. So. All right. So another question was, has your career influenced your decision about children, marriage, or a similar long-term relationship? So this wasn't saying, do you have children, are you married, but just whether or not you wanted to be a scientist. Does that change, is that impacting, is that part of your thought process for whether or not you are gonna have children, get married, or be in a long-term partnership? You can see for the majority of women, for 58% of women, this plays a role in what's happening for their lives. So that's something that's important to understand, and can be conversations that we can have with folks kind of as they're starting their careers in universities, to understand what resources and supports are available, what are other stories of individuals who have been able to kind of develop the life that they want in these fields, and how can we create more systems to be supporting where you can be both a scientist and you can have a family. So another question that we asked was, how supportive has your partner or spouse been of your work? And this is something that we don't see big differences for in very supportive, right? Both men and women say that, they've got a lot of, that their spouse is very supportive. So that's something that's nice to see. But we do see some differences down here. So if we're not at all supportive, again, there's some similarities. Really what we see is when you break down the numbers and you start to listen to the stories, it's kind of these somewhat supportive, and people who, men and women are identifying supportive a little bit differently. So what a woman sees as supportive is different than what a man sees as supportive for them to finish their career, and the qualitative analysis between these numbers is something that's important to understand. So, all right, so now we're going to get into some of the discrimination questions. So discrimination isn't something that's easy to talk about, and it's not something that's easy for a lot of people to answer. But we do have a handful of kind of basic questions around discrimination that were on here. So again, this is looking at the whole region, so understanding who's being discriminated for different reasons and what the gender difference is. So based on gender, clearly there's a big difference here. So women, 49% of women in Latin America say that they have been discriminated based on gender, compared to only 2% of men. But there's still 2% of men who feel like their gender is bringing them down. For age discrimination, this is something that we see consistently in the global data too, that women are much more likely to be discriminated because of age than men are. So as women are getting older, you're not getting prestige and you're not building networks and kind of increasing your career, you're starting to face additional levels of discrimination. That's something that's really important to understand, because a lot of the solutions that we're looking for is how to increase women in leadership. So we need to understand that a lot of the times as you get to those senior levels and you can be involved in leadership, you're also facing this new discrimination that is much more unique to women than men. So that's something for us to explore globally that we see from this survey. For here in Latin America, around race and ethnicity, men were more likely to say that they were discriminated based on race and ethnicity than women. A lot of the numbers here are really low, so we have to be really careful. They're just high enough for us to report, but 1% of individuals said discriminated on disability. It's important to understand that there's probably only a small percentage of individuals who have a disability who are reporting in the survey. So it doesn't mean that people aren't being discriminated for disability, it just means that our population numbers there are really low. Religion was something that was not seen as an issue in Latin America. And for our global response, it's something that we were kind of surprised is not much of an issue anywhere. For marital status, this is something, again, that's similar to having children. Women are discriminated against for marital status on both sides of it. So women in higher professional workplaces are discriminated because they're married, and they can be discriminated because they have children. When you're starting your career, if you're a woman and you're not married, you can also face discrimination because people want to know why you're not married and what's wrong with you, versus nobody's asking men those questions. So when we break down and hear the stories, that's the type of data that's actually coming out of those numbers. But there is a difference, and it's kind of a lose-lose in the way that society is looking at women in marital status. Social status was very much the same. So if your social status is discriminated against, there's not a gender difference there. For pregnancy and responsibility for children, again, we see much higher levels of discrimination for women than we do for men. This goes back to what I've been saying, in these studies that we did the last time that we did one of these global studies, we saw that men were actually rewarded for having children while women were often demoted for having children. And then there's some other categories of discrimination that we did not capture, and it's something that's important because these are our higher levels, right? We're saying 10 and 13% of individuals are reporting other discrimination, and that's something that we need to start to understand so that we can truly understand what's happening to our workforce. And unfortunately, we don't have kind of the detail of data that we would need to unpack kind of those additional areas of discrimination.
So there was no good question.
Yeah. This is a graph that I just threw together last night, so I apologize that it's not the neatest looking thing, but I wanted to be able to look at how folks feel that they are discouraged based on their discipline in Latin America. So what's important here is if there's an X in the box, then women are more likely to feel discouraged than men are. So you can see the majority of these boxes have X's. So in all of our fields, for different aspects of your career, so whether it's research, funding, interactions with your colleagues, workplace environment, personal life, family obligation, or other reasons, women are much more likely to feel discouraged at different stages of their education or career. The only areas that we don't see this, which again, this just means that they were on the same level. It doesn't mean that men were higher. So chemistry feels like funding they're not being discouraged because of funding. And history of science and philosophy of science feels that their personal life is similar between men and women. And then mathematics down here has for interactions with colleagues, there's not a difference for discouragement and for workplace environment. But for the vast majority of people across the region, for women across the region, there's much higher levels of discouragement for every reason that we could put on our survey. So again, this is something that we really want to talk about to understand where this discouragement is coming from and if there's mechanisms for us to address that. Because if you're feeling discouraged, you're less likely to either continue in your studies or continue in your career. So this is some of the qualitative that I pulled together for us to understand some of the themes of what's happening with discouragement. So we asked people why they felt discouraged, and they were able to have an open-ended response. One of the big things was funding. So women consistently felt discouraged because of funding, whether because it's difficult to get funds or because they're not getting access to funds because of their gender. Here are some more quotes from funding. So having to encourage people to do research is difficult because they're not interested. The lack of money for doing research makes the process difficult. So this was somebody who was talking not just about personal funding for themselves, but also the salary that you make as a scientist and kind of the resource opportunities that you have afterwards. So that was a little bit of a different take on funding. Most of the respondents were talking about difficulty getting grant funding and research funding. People were also discouraged for a number of different reasons in the workplace. This person lists a bunch of reasons. So they were discouraged by research. Sometimes I cannot see real meaning of some of the projects. They were discouraged because of funding. Brazil and other countries are not investing in science and education. Many projects are failing due to lack of support because of their workplace environment. I have no window in my office, 9 hours of white, cold light, and the computer monitor. I don't know if it's day, if it's raining. I'm coming home later every day. So this was someone in Brazil in biology who was just talking about kind of the reality of what work looked like for them. Here is another or two more examples of discouragement in the workplace. So here we have harassment through anti-Semitic and misogynistic public emails on the part of a golden colleague from the department and a lack of action on the part of the school. Luckily, I did have support from my department. But this is, people create toxic workplaces. So even if it's just one person who's in your department, often they can publicly do things that are very discriminatory and discouraging, and they don't always have consequences for that. And it's the people who that impact that are now making decisions about whether or not they're staying in those fields and what's happening with their career. Here's another one. My university does not support science, and the administrative workload is enormous. It does not allow you to advance in your field of research. The work environment isn't academically challenging, and it's extremely mediocre. So this is somebody who kind of from a different angle is struggling with what expectations are of their work. This person has a lot of undergraduates and is just kind of seen as paper pushing and grading versus being able to do a lot of their own research in the work environment. Here's another one. This is a long quote, but we'll go through it. So the stress that research produces, the need to publish and to be evaluated consistently, to ask for funding, scholarships, and a stable position is discouraging for continuing in the field of research. During research, the lack of funding for networking, attending conferences, makes you feel really isolated and outside of the math environment. On a personal level, I have felt discouraged at not being able to balance my program with my former partner, who was not in an academic environment. To be able to continue my postdoctoral education involved a change of residence, and that change was not well supported by that person. I can see the difference in this regard, since I currently involved with somebody in an academic environment who supports that kind of change and seeks them out for himself as well. So this person talks about a lot of things, and they got categorized in a lot of different areas in the analysis, but you can see they talk about the funding, the workplace, the research, those difficulties, and they also talk about relationships and what that support means and how that support has changed for them over time. Here's some more. There's a lot of people discouraged, unfortunately. So there's limited support for resolving administrative, management, and liaison problems. This is something we saw a lot, and we got most of these quotes were actually from Mexico. It was something that came up again and again, that there wasn't the administrative support, or that the administrative support was expected of women and not of men. So that was a particular trend. And then the academic environment is very competitive and male-dominated. So sometimes I feel less capable than my colleagues. Besides that, we have more people and fewer jobs in the field. This decreases chances of getting funding. So this is a physicist from Brazil who was talking about kind of their workplace environment. We often hear competitive being talked about more negatively by women than by men. And often that's because, again, we have systems that are supporting men and that are not supporting women in those environments. Here we have some folks that were talking about resources. Women are underestimated or undervalued. That makes it difficult to get funding, which is generally determined by groups led by men. So these are the systemic things that we were talking about earlier today that we're hearing from individuals specifically. And then poor funding. I sometimes feel my colleagues don't respect me or that they treat the men in my group better. This whole unfair work environment sometimes makes me unhappy. A couple of more. So due to the lack of space for support and consideration of personal problems that affect academic development. So this was somebody who was discouraged by not having the resources that they felt their department should be giving them, and it comes back to some of their work-life balance. And then we have people talking about funding and insecurity, which around jobs and employment, which is really consistent in the female responses that we have. A lot of people were also discouraged by their career, whether because they weren't being recognized, because they were delayed for various reasons, or because they can't get into the research that they're actually passionate about, and they don't have the salaries that are supporting the jobs that they want to do and the research they want to do. Okay, so we're also gonna, this last one looks at if you've ever encountered any sexual harassment at school or work. So at the very end of the survey, we asked folks about sexual harassment. And here you can see that 63% of men said that they've never encountered sexual harassment. So it's not that it's never happened to them. They've never seen it happen. They've never been around it. They've never heard about it. It doesn't exist, right? 63% of men. Surprisingly, 45% of women also said that they've never encountered any sexual harassment. Whether or not you've heard about something happening, so here 34% of women and 31% of men said that they've heard about something. Having it happen to them, 24% of women compared to 6% of, sorry, these numbers are mixed up, sorry. Happened to them here is 24 compared to 3% of men. And then for witnessing it happen, 12% of women have witnessed it happen compared to only 6% of men. Again, there's a lot of dynamics that we need to understand in this. One is that sexual harassment is happening more to women. It's also more noticeable, and women understand what sexual harassment is, and they see it around them. And whether or not it's happening to you or it's happening to the people around you, it can have similar impacts. And this is something that we can work on awareness and understanding and reporting by men and male colleagues to try to improve this situation as well. With the discrimination questions that we had, we also had an open-ended for discrimination. So we had our list that we talked about around marital status, age, gender, but there was a lot of other people who talked about various parts of their identity that they faced discrimination for. A lot of people talked about immigration, being a foreigner. Folks talked about kind of the quality of education that they felt they came from or where they were working and that kind of social status, what that meant. Sexual orientation, something that comes up a lot in Latin America and doesn't come up in other regions as much is this notion that if you're a beautiful woman, that you can't be smart, that those two things are opposite. So if you're somebody who looks good, then you can't understand physics, you can't do math, you can't do any of that. And that's a form of discrimination that we see more in Latin America than in some other regions. There's also a lot of these ideas of personal connections. So this person specifically said not being a friend of the director, but it's these networks and personal connections that some folks have, and if you don't have that, then you're kind of knocked down because of it. That came up. This repeats, so yeah. Okay, so those are a lot of kind of the big findings for Latin America as a whole. What it's going to run into now is a lot of words because we have key findings for South America and for the Caribbean. Where are we at on time?
We have the coffee break in 15 minutes, but maybe we can, do you want to open it to questions or something? But this is important. Okay, let's go.
Okay, so we'll start running through these. These might take a time. Again, if you have questions throughout these, I would encourage you to ask them now as well. We have a bunch of time to be doing this and to have discussions down the line. So there's a lot of text, and having people talk and ask questions or share experience with some of these things will kind of help liven it up.
Because you're giving so much information.
I know.
I don't know if you want to ask questions now or make comments. Then we will have a coffee break at 5, and then we come back and Laura can continue speaking. Do you want to make comments or ask questions about what she's shown so far? Because there has been so much information that I start to forget, actually. So.
I don't think I need the mic.
Okay.
Okay. Laura, I was interested by one of your graphics,
Mm-hmm.
the discrimination thing,
Yeah.
gender, age, and then you go by race and ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, at least here in Brazil,
Yeah.
we would have some cuts because what stuck to me was the disability bar.
Mm-hmm.
So here in Brazil, people who have some disability,
Yeah.
any of hearing impaired or blindness or even mobility,
Mm-hmm.
they don't get to the
Exactly.
university level. So how do you understand, or how do you discuss your data with this kind of cross-cutting information?
Yeah, so that's what I was trying to say when I presented it, is that those 1% of discrimination for disability isn't because people aren't being discriminated for disability. It's because the numbers of scientists that are out there with disabilities are low. And that's something that we have to qualify and understand what those ranks are. It's the same thing, that we have to ask ourselves around race. Is there not discrimination because of race? And I mean, these do show that there's discrimination, but it's also because folks aren't in those professional or in the work environments because of discrimination that's happened before they can get to that point. So yes, I completely agree that that's critical to understand. And in countries where we have religious minorities that are an important thing, it's the same conversation that we have to have. We have to say, the minorities, it's not saying that discrimination doesn't happen, it's saying that we're not hearing a lot of voices. And there's voices that are left out of this conversation. So thank you for highlighting that. Yeah.
Questions, comments? Or you are so surprised and shocked?
Is there
by the
anything that
numbers?
surprised folks from it, or does it all seem pretty standard? Those are, yeah.
Yes, I have a question. In the first graph, I don't remember what, do you have a very large percentage of the other
Right.
people.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so in Latin America, we had the largest group of respondents were folks who did not fall within our partner categories of disciplines. So we opened the survey up to a large field of participants. And you could say that, and, so if you were a lawyer, you could still get through some of the survey. You get kicked out eventually because we weren't as concerned about what your discrimination in the workplace was if you were a lawyer. But you could get through some of it. For Latin America, specifically this region had a large percentage of people who weren't in the 6 categories of the international unions that sponsored the survey and are the primary pieces of analysis. So, yeah. And that's what kind of, there was a slide that was earlier that looked at a full list of disciplines for the whole survey. And you can see some of the breakdown and people that are coming from different areas in that. And that's part of the difference, yeah. So those folks are really limited in the analysis. So we have a smaller Latin American report that if folks are interested in, we can, the findings that I'm sharing in a second are the reports from the South American and Caribbean and Central America reports. And those ones only include people who fall within the 7 or so disciplines. It doesn't include folks who fall in that other category.
I think another key point about the research here in Brazil is about the payment.
Yeah.
Because I think when you are a professor in a university, it's the same salary for the same category in the field. I don't know, an associate teacher and the others. You don't have a different payment for women and men. So yeah. I think it add a bias in the responses.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I also think the previous speaker said that she discovered there was still like a 30% pay gap in some way, whether that be additional income. I'm not sure. She made a point about that today, that there still is somehow pay differences that are occurring. Yeah.
I can add to that. It's because administrative jobs usually pay a little bit more bonus up to your salary, and male partners are more, professors are more likely to get these jobs, so they get an add-on to their base salary. The base salary is the same, but you have more bonuses according to your administrative jobs.
But also the bolsa de productividad, because maybe men and women have different access to higher positions. So maybe you feel you have the same qualifications, but you don't get the same job, and so your salary is less.
Yes, but I think it's really important to know because the numbers for Latin America aren't as big as some of the other regions.
Yeah, because
so
we don't negotiate our salaries basically in the academic thing.
Right.
But you have easier access to better paid jobs or not, but the salaries are sort of fixed.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point, and that's one of those things. So hopefully a lot of this analysis, so the work that's happening that Slovena and some other folks in this room are working on right now, we're writing this big report that's going to be coming out. And there's regional discussion. So we're going to talk about South America, we're going to talk about Central and America and the Caribbean. But we don't have all of the in-depth knowledge that we need to qualify all of the numbers, and we don't go into country-specific things. So Brazil on its own is never brought up in these larger reports. And something that Slovena wanted me to mention, and I think is really important, is that part of this research is we have this huge data set, right? And we want people to be able to make decisions based on the numbers that are being collected and based on the data. And something that you can do is that you can write and submit a research proposal to a committee, and you can get access to the data set. So if you want to understand specifically what's happening in Brazil, the best way to do that is to form a group of folks who can get some of that research done or to talk to, a lot of times we also put it on the physical scientists to be doing this. You can also go and find a social scientist who could turn this into their master's degree, and tell them which questions you want them to answer and have them do the analysis. But this data is available for more country-specific work to happen. And as you saw, Brazil has enough responses that you can do that. Unfortunately, there's a lot of countries where there's not enough responses for country-level analysis, which is why we have a lot of these bigger regions. So I encourage people to talk about that, to think about projects. What are the questions that are most relevant to the work that you're doing here that can make the most change for the work that you're doing here? What resources can go into that? And how can we put together proposals so that those numbers can get out and benefit everybody's country here as best that it can?
Thanks for your talk. I was wondering, what about the issues and discrimination on the LGBT community? How do you guys evaluate this on this research?
Yeah, so unfortunately, again, these were discussions that happened kind of on the global level about what was going to be measured here. And the project is on the gender gap, and we don't do a lot of work on intersectionality within that. So we didn't ask about race, because race is something that changes between different countries and different regions. It doesn't have a stable meaning. So there's no questions about race. There's no questions about LGBT. We didn't ask about orientation. A lot of the reason that there's not additional gender categories on there is because there were specific regions that were particularly worried about having additional gender categories. So there are countries where it's illegal to identify outside of kind of the set binary of gender norms, or to have sexual orientation besides male-female relationships. So there was something that was a larger conversation that we couldn't protect those individuals if they answered it. So we don't have any of that data, which is unfortunate. I think it's really important. But right now we're really just focusing on gender, and that's the analysis that comes out of this.
In any case, for gender, we had 3 options. It was female, male, and prefer not to respond. But there were not too many responses that said prefer not to respond.
Right.
So.
Yeah, there's less than 400, so there's very little that the numbers weren't large enough. And for what it means to prefer not to respond, we can't assume that we understand what prefer not to respond means. So just because you prefer not to respond, it doesn't mean that you don't identify as a man or a woman. It could, we at the American Institute of Physics, we run surveys all the time, and we do have additional gender categories, and we have an area for people to write in, and people will write things like, my gender is a fighter pilot. And you're just like, okay, we know that's not your gender, you just think that it's silly to ask gender questions. So we can't interpret what it means to say prefer not to respond, which is also why we can't really do analysis on that question. And it's slow, but hopefully we'll keep evolving and improving in those areas.
Hi. About this issue about the discrimination based on looks. Mm-hmm. I had read recently an article saying that even though people might not report feeling discriminated on looks, many scientists, female scientists, feel the need to change their style or the way they dress or they present themselves in order to be respected.
Yeah.
Or not change, knowing that it might lead to some discrimination.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So again, that's something that's particularly pronounced in Latin America, that we see at least women speaking out against it. And it's not new. When we did the survey for physicists specifically, we also saw these same comments that were coming out, that folks felt like they had to choose between kind of what they wanted their outside identity, how they wanted to dress, how they wanted to present to the world, and whether or not that identified them as a scientist. And it's something, for some people, they saw it as a privilege where they can change it. They can say that I'm going to wear sloppier clothes and people will respect me, which is different than, if you're a person of color or you have a different sexual orientation, or, there's other ones, other categories that we can talk about, kind of what that means for folks. But it's something that's really pronounced in Latin America and should be talked about more. Yeah.
So, yes. The last one. When you talk about the student, the
relationship between the student with the supervisor.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know that the supervisor was woman or man?
We do have that question. This analysis doesn't break it down, but we have the capability to do that. Yeah, and I don't know if some of that is in the more detailed findings, but we do have that capability. Yeah. Unfortunately, just having a female advisor doesn't necessarily mean your relationship is better, but that's something that's really regionally different. In the US, having a female advisor often isn't as much of a benefit as in some other regions. So that's something that'll get talked about on the larger picture.
Okay. So maybe we can go to the coffee break and then come back for the key findings.
Thank you.